ethics is an interesting question, and it's an important one. The first thing I'd say is that it's only by understanding behavioral science that you can really spot very, very dubious ethical behaviors. So something that would be, I think, dubious ethically, not necessarily wrong, but debatable, would be the practice of a website where, when you had spent a large amount of time deciding what flight you wanted, when you were going to travel, when you'd committed a considerable amount of time and effort in building your itinerary, suddenly sprang some extra charges at you at the last minute. You weren't expecting them, but your sunk cost in terms of going through this bloody website and finally talking to your wife about which date, which time the flight should go, suddenly it says, oh, and you need to pay an extra £8. That I would consider to be really, really dubious, because it's exploiting a kind of path dependency in human behavior. It's creating an artificial sunk cost which really shouldn't be there and for which there's no excuse. Now, you might say, of course, that the same thing can be used for good, that there may be cases where actually using commitment, forcing people to make a certain amount of initial effort, then helps them go on to perform greater good things. Now, one of the things I was just debating recently is, at the moment, you can only get a government subsidy to install a 7 kilowatt charging point for your electric car at home when you already own an electric car. And I said that's totally stupid. What you should do is persuade people to install electric charging points on their driveway, knowing full well that once they've got an electric charging point, the next car they're going to buy is probably going to be electric. Because let's face it, if you've gone to the trouble of installing an electric charging point, you'd feel a bit of a dickhead having a diesel car parked next to it. Now, I would say that's using exactly the same trickery, but in this case, possibly for good. Okay? So one thing you can do, I think, is learn a little bit from the scamsters and crooks of the world and say, can the same thing that's sometimes deployed entirely to mislead people and to distort their behavior, can it also, the same thing, be deployed in a healthy way? But the most important thing is, until we understand behavioral science well, we won't have the vocabulary or the insight to debate what's moral or immoral. And remember that when the credit card was designed, I mentioned this earlier in a few of my talks, when the credit card was first designed, nobody knew the phrase the default. And they didn't think it was unreasonable to set a default minimum payment which was insanely low as a proportion of your overall credit card debt, therefore meaning that a person who followed the default would end up paying an insane amount of interest over an absurdly long time just to return their card to zero. The default should have been, I think, a multiple of 2 or 3 at the very least of that minimum payment. But in order to spot that, you actually need to have the vocabulary to understand what's going on. And so one of the things I think is important about behavioral science, it can not only help us spot those things which are obstacles to behavioral change, it can also help us spot those things which make a particular behavior or course of action which may be highly helpful. This is exactly what Richard Thaler actually calls a sludge rather than a nudge, something which in a sense benefits the vendor much more than it does the customer. We can become wise to those things when we have the vocabulary to spot them and to call them out.